Thank you very much for being here with us today. I am Valeria Gonzalez, Economic Officer at the Embassy of Colombia in Turkey, and on behalf of the Ambassador of Colombia, Mr. Julio Aníbal Riaño, and the Ambassador of Spain in Turkey, Mr. Javier E, I'd like to welcome you all to this conference. The Embassies of Colombia and Spain, in collaboration with the World Bank Group, are delighted to host this event. We're very grateful with the World Bank for sharing with us its latest research on the issues of poverty and inequality, in particular with the World Bank Turkey Country Office. Likewise, we would like to thank our speaker, Dr. Javier Baez, who is a senior economist at the World Bank. During this conference, I'm going to kindly ask you to please keep your microphones on mute. Now, I will give the floor to my colleague from the Spanish Embassy, Berta, who will give a brief introduction about the speaker, as well as provide some instructions regarding the questions and answer session. Thank you.
Thank you, Valeria. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Berta Bragado, Cultural Manager at the Embassy of Spain. And first of all, I would like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Javier E. Baez. Holding a Ph.D. in economics from Syracuse University, he is a senior economist in the Poverty and Equity Global Practice of the World Bank and a researcher at the Institute for Labor Economics. He has more than 12 years of experience analyzing the causes of poverty and inequality and evaluating the effectiveness of policies to alleviate them and strengthen inclusiveness in countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, South and East Asia, and Africa. Mr. Baez is now based in Ankara, Turkey, where he works at the World Bank office and leads the dialogue on poverty reduction, equity, and economic inclusiveness. The conference will last approximately 30 minutes, and afterwards we will have some time for a Q&A with the speaker. So if you have any questions, I will kindly ask you to raise your hand, and then at the end of the conference, and my colleague Valeria will invite you to unmute your microphone. Thank you very much. And now I will give the floor to the speaker, Javier Baez. Welcome, and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you very much. Thanks everyone. I first want to thank the embassies of Colombia and Spain for inviting me to share some of my thoughts on this very important issue of poverty and inequality, which I think it doesn't have the visibility that other challenges nowadays get in the media. But that I personally believe will be a very pressing issue in the coming years. I want to say that this is not a very pretentious talk. It is just basically me sharing some thoughts and supporting these thoughts by evidence. I just want to motivate through this talk the debate about the need to push for a more economic inclusive agenda in a post-pandemic world. So I've prepared a presentation. Let me share the screen with you. Hold on a second. Okay, can you please, yeah, I think you see the presentation now, right?
Yes, that's correct.
Perfect. Okay. I hope you see it in a presentation mode, right?
Yeah, absolutely. All is correct.
Excellent. Okay, good. So before getting started, I also want to explicitly acknowledge that I'm supporting my points by evidence that have been produced by many colleagues across the World Bank. I don't claim to be the author of all these numbers, but on the contrary, the thanks should go to all of them, and also to other institutions that have been providing a lot of interesting data. So I'm very grateful for that. So let me start by giving you just a brief long-term development perspective. We tend to think about what's happening in the last few months, but we tend to forget that many things have happened in the past. So what you see in this graph is the GDP per capita going back 150 years. And we tend to take economic progress as granted. But the truth is that humanity went a long path before getting to where we are right now. And we are very privileged to be part of the last, let's say, 2 or 3 generations. And why do I say that? Just look at the graph and see people from our current generation, people from the last, say, 60, 70, 80 years, the last 2 generations. And what you see is that we are now many times richer than people in the past. So just to give you an idea, in 2016, for example, the average GDP per capita, which again is a proxy of the standards of living of the population, was $14,500 per person. This is a level of prosperity that is 11 times higher than it used to be 150 years ago. Let me even make a closer comparison in terms of time. If you go back to 1960, right now we are 3.5 times richer than we were 60 years ago. And even 2000, a year that turned the corner of the last century 20 years ago, we are now 50% richer than we used to be in 2000. So this is a world of economic prosperity, the one that we have been enjoying. And so I wanted to set that clear at the onset of this presentation. But I know that what is in your minds right now is that not everyone has benefited equally from this, right? And you're absolutely right. I was just showing you the average GDP per capita, but that hides a lot of differences across the world. And so what you see in this graph is exactly the same the same number, but disaggregated across different regions of the world. Obviously, what you see is that some regions have been much more productive than others. And this is reflected in large disparities in standards of living and levels of development. So to give you an example in this graph, what you can see is that the GDP per capita in Western Europe is, for instance, twice as big as countries in neighboring Eastern Europe, or 3.5 times higher than in Latin America and the Caribbean. So there are large regional differences in economic progress. But relative to earlier times, economic prosperity in every region today is higher than ever before in their entire history. And that progress has been strong and widespread enough to make a sustained dent on world poverty. So the number of people that was living below the international poverty line, which is $1.9 per day per person, that number decreased from nearly 2 billion people in 1990 to 689 in 2017. So this is equivalent to reducing poverty, extreme poverty, by more than 1 billion people in 3 decades, which is spectacular. And this is equivalent to taking out 45 million people, lifting 45 million people out of poverty every year. So this is like reducing poverty in a country like Spain, Argentina, or Kenya, just to give you an order of magnitude, every single year, which is fantastic. So this is remarkable progress, of course, largely driven by stellar growth in China that helped hundreds of millions to escape poverty. Yet, I know the level or the number of people living in extreme poverty still remains unacceptably high. And there are several reasons to believe that, as you will see during the rest of the talk, we won't be able to meet the target of reducing the share of people living in extreme poverty to below 3%, which is a target that was set by the World Bank a few years ago. We were close to make that, but recent events, particularly COVID, as you will see, is derailing us from that objective. And so, moving into the main point of this presentation, let me illustrate what COVID-19 means for poverty reduction globally. So, just broadly speaking, this epidemic has been a major setback for the fight against poverty. Our recent calculations estimate that the COVID-19 induced new extreme poor will rise to approximately 125 million in 2020. So new poor in the order of 120 million in 2020, possibly reaching 160 million new poor in this year, 2021. How big is that? Well, that corresponds to all the poverty reduction that the world achieved between 2014 and 2019. So it's like this crisis is wiping out all the gains in poverty reduction achieved in the last 5 years. Poverty will increase for the first time in 20 years. As you see in this graph, these are changes in poverty going back to 1991. The only other episode where we saw poverty increasing in the last 20 years was the Asian financial crisis in 97, 98. Back then, poverty increased by around 60 million people. So just 1/3 of the increase in poverty that we see now due to COVID. This is just to give you an order of magnitude what we are talking about. So our concerns are not only about poverty, but also about inequality. And COVID-19 could well reinforce inequality trends that were already in motion across and within countries even well before the pandemic, as you can see from the graph in the left. The graph in the left is showing measures of income inequality across a group of developed countries, and you see in the first half of the for a previous century, reduction in inequality, but then since the 1980s, 1990s particularly, a continuous increase in inequality. And for the reasons that we'll discuss during the presentation, you will see that most likely this inequality will be further exacerbated in the next few years. So let's look at the inequality of outcomes, how prevalent it was even before COVID. So what you see in this graph on the right is the share of the top decile in total income across, I'm sorry, I got a message here in my computer saying that it will restart, but in 7 hours, fortunately. Okay, and so, so what you see in this graph, what I'm saying is this shows the share of the top decile of the total income distribution in the populations. And by deciles, I mean, imagine that you organize the population from the poorest person to the richest, and imagine that this is economy with 10 people, where they are sorted from the lowest income person to the highest income person. And then these graphs here, these bars, show what amount of the total income in the economy goes to the top richest 10 percentile of that distribution. And look at the levels of inequality. For instance, in India and Brazil, the 10% of the population have 56% of the total income in those economies. And there are regions where inequality is even much higher. So this is the context that was before the pandemic, and we have strong reasons to believe that this would worsen mostly within countries. So Oops. Let me then move to the next slide. Yeah. So let's not forget that COVID has been one in a century crisis. In many ways, COVID-19 is not like any other shock. I want to give you a sense of the scale of this crisis. Out of 181 countries, 169, meaning 93% of these countries, saw their growth projections worsen between April and October 2020. So of the 189 countries that we monitor globally, 93% of them had to revise the growth projections between April and October 2020. Historically, this is the largest share of countries, and this is shown in this graph, the largest share of countries experiencing a contraction of GDP of that level since the Great Depression. In the Great Depression, over 80% of the global economy experienced a GDP contraction. Well, this time is 93. So this is really a one in a century crisis. The economic costs due to the crisis are of unprecedented magnitude. Our estimates shown in this graph indicate that global GDP contracted by more than 4% in 2020. And it could have been way worse had not China witnessed a very robust recovery after a very slow economy in the first quarter of 2020. So had not China experienced the growth that it recorded, then these numbers would have been a lot worse in 2020. But the effects don't stop in 2020, unfortunately. The damage of COVID on economies will linger for a while. By 2002, our estimates predict that global GDP will fall by 4.4%, below pre-pandemic projections, with this gap being even larger in emerging and developing economies. This gap will be between 6 and 8.5%, and so nearly twice as large as it will be in advanced economy. And of course, all these calculations are produced with a lot of uncertainty. We don't know what's going to happen in 2022 and the years ahead. And the recovery will be certainly dampened by the effects of diminished physical and human capital accumulation on labor productivity, something that I will elaborate a bit more in the next few slides. Okay, so let me now move to the second part of the talk, where I want to focus now on why I think COVID-19 is a perfect storm for low-income households, and a perfect storm I mean it in a negative way. From a conceptual perspective, and broadly speaking, we can say that COVID-19 will affect household welfare. And by household welfare, I mean consumption, the standards of living of households. This will be affected through four main channels. The first one is, of course, the health effects, diseases, deaths. The second one is job and income losses and the related price changes in the economy. The third one is service disruption, school closures, overcrowding of hospitals, and so on. And finally, a fourth channel, which I don't discuss in this presentation, but is also important, is non-labor income, public and private transfers that can help mitigate the effects of the crisis. So I'm going to focus on the first three, and that's what you see in the graph. I'm going to start talking now about the effects of the crisis on the public health side, then move to the income side, jobs and incomes, and then finish with service disruption. So I'll start with very interesting numbers coming from the US. and as I said, focusing first on the public health side of the crisis. So except for differences in age, what you hear all the time is people arguing that everyone is equally susceptible to catch COVID-19 and to die from it. So when you take into account age differences, what you hear all the time is everyone is equally vulnerable to be affected by COVID. Yeah, this claim is common, but it's false. It's not true. What you see in this graph is data from the US, and is basically showing, let me start with the graph on the right. The darker side means number of cases among African Americans in the United States, cases of COVID-19, that are more than proportional, meaning that they are higher than the share of the population. Virtually in all states of the United States, African Americans overrepresent the number of positive cases of COVID-19 by 50%. So, for instance, if in a state as Pennsylvania, African Americans represent 20% of the population, as an example, then they represent 30% of the cases. And this is a pattern that you observe in all states across the US. It also happens among Hispanics, Latinos, Native Americans. For instance, Latinos represent 60% of the cases above their proportional share of the population and 30% of the deaths. And so it doesn't matter what minority group you look at, they are more likely to suffer from both positive cases and deaths. And the reason is low income people need to go out. They need to make their living, and they live in more crowded places. So observing the social distancing measures are way more difficult for them. Many of them are not covered by health insurance or don't have access to healthcare services. I'm not showing numbers for less developed countries, but the numbers are even more striking if we look at countries of lower levels of development. So on the health side, they are more likely to suffer the most. Let's talk now about jobs and incomes. And in this graph, what you see is data from 52 countries, mostly, all of them countries in developing regions, that were collected to high frequency phone surveys that the bank put in place shortly after COVID started to monitor the socioeconomic conditions of the population. The World Bank, working with other partners, national statistical institutes and other development partners, to deploy all these data collection systems. And then what you see in this graph is a summary coming recently for these 52 countries. Over 1/3 of respondents in these countries say that they stopped working after COVID. So imagine 1/3 of the population unable to work. And nearly half of those who were not working as usual, meaning working fewer hours or fewer days, report receiving partial or no payment at all. So the job losses are of a magnitude never seen before. So then let's look at the other side of the same issue as incomes. If they cannot work, then what's happening with their incomes? Well, unsurprisingly, incomes have collapsed for a large number of households too, particularly in developing countries. This is what you see in this graph. What you see is a high share of the population reporting that they lost their incomes, and it's as high as 70 to 85% in some of these countries. For instance, Peru, 80% of households in Peru that stopped working, reporting that they lost their incomes. So yeah, definitely a big crisis. And if we go one step further to illustrate the consequences of COVID on household welfare, let's look at the most important item of consumption of the population, which is food. So the consequences of losing jobs, losing incomes, go as far as reducing food consumption. Surprisingly, as it could be in many developed countries, that's the case. So what you can see in the graphs is, in many countries, more than half of the population are skipping a meal due to lack of money or other resources. As expected, obviously this food insecurity issue is higher in low-income countries, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. So if we try to use all this data to get some insights about what factors help predict the loss of income during COVID, our analysis showed that no matter what region, what country, what type of data you analyze, the results are pretty much the same everywhere. Groups of people such as unskilled workers, meaning those who have just primary education or even less, workers with informal jobs, as you can see in this graph, workers with seasonal work, young workers, and women, all these groups are bearing the brunt of the crisis. The case of women is a particular one. In many countries, we have seen high increases in unemployment among women, proportionally more than among men. Many women withdrawing from the labor market, stopping their participation, largely because of the school closures and the responsibilities of taking care of children at home. And so this is really dampening the economic opportunities of many women across the world. So I'm now moving to what I think in my presentation is the most telling graph, or the most telling numbers, which is also from the US. And it's basically showing that low-income households were losing more during the peak of the crisis, and also they are lagging behind during the recovery. This graph shows the percentage change in employment for three groups of workers. We have high-wage workers, those making $60,000 or more, middle-wage workers between $27,000 and $60,000, and then those that earn less than $27,000, which we call here low-wage workers. And I want you to see this is the dynamics of employment losses before COVID, during the peak of the COVID crisis, the pandemic, and then the recovery phase. You see that for high-wage workers, two main points stand out from this analysis. They experienced a relatively small contraction of employment, big relative to our crisis, but small to what you see in other groups of the population. So 12%, about 13% of employment among high workers was lost, but this didn't last for long. At the beginning of the summer, almost all the losses were recovered for high-wage workers. And by the end of the summer, late August, all wage workers were back to work. Even after that, we see positive employment growth about high-wage workers. Let me move now to the other extreme of the distribution. I won't analyze the middle wage group, but you will be able to tell from the low wage group. The low wage group experienced a big contraction of employment, nearly 40%, shortly after the national emergency was declared in the US. Yes, we start seeing some recovery, but a mild one. And now, almost a year after the crisis, employment is almost 25% below among low-wage workers. And so they did not only suffer the most from the employment contraction, but they are unable to regain their jobs. And by the way, I wanted to say that analysis like this we have been doing in many countries of the world, and including here in Turkey, and we see a very similar pattern among different workers, with informal workers, low-wage workers, and young workers experiencing the largest losses. Then you might remember that graph where I have the three channels to which I think households, low-income households are being affected the most from COVID. And the last one was on service disruption. And the most notable example is what we can call a crisis within another crisis, and it's the human capital crisis. And we, those who of us who have kids, have experienced it ourselves. That with these school closures will have long-lasting and sizable effects on human capital. So I personally find this one of the more challenging problems going forward. So at the peak, temporary school closures were implemented in more than 180 countries worldwide. This kept about 1.6 billion students out of school. And for about half of these students, actually close to 900 million students, these school closures have exceeded 10 months. So almost an entire academic year. So learning of children has, as we all know, severely interrupted, especially in lower income countries and countries that were already suffering from human capital deficits. Within countries, urban children and children with better educated parents, they have been able to continue learning, perhaps not perfectly, but distance learning has worked to some extent for these households, but not for low-income households. So even though most countries have made heroic efforts to put remote and remedial learning strategies in place, learning losses are very likely to happen. Imagine the situation in low-income countries where less than one in 4 households in these countries have access to internet. So 3 out of 4 households are unable to connect to internet and therefore not able to benefit from distance learning. And if we move to upper middle income countries like Turkey, Colombia, many countries in Latin America, well, even less than 70% of the population on average have access to internet. Analysis show that the costs of the human capital crisis are mounting fast. We estimate an average reduction of nearly 1 year in school attainment, which is huge. It will take many years to recover that year of education loss. And this, of course, varies a lot across countries. If we want to put a value to this, a monetary value, we estimate that this is equivalent to a loss of about $1,400 loss per student per year for their lifetime, if this is not addressed, which corresponds to $16 trillion. So just to give you an order of magnitude, the relief package discussed in the US is less than $2 trillion. Well, we are talking about $16 trillion in losses due to school closures and the reduced human capital of affected children. Now moving to the last part of my presentation, in the interest of time, let me just briefly mention two other underlying and long-standing challenges that will make the task of eliminating poverty more daunting in the years ahead. And one of them is climate change. So we know that the risks of climate change manifest themselves in many ways. We know, ranging from drought, high temperatures, hurricanes and floods, to disruption of production systems, particularly in agriculture. So many, many different manifestations of climate change. Our research at the bank shows that every time there is a shock that could be linked to climate change, we observe large increases in poverty and then further deprivation among those who were already poor. So in this map, I just brought this map to illustrate the point that I'm trying to make. It's with one of those risks, which is flooding. So we estimate that 1.47 billion people will be in areas with high flood risks in the next few years, of which about 150 million of them are extreme poor people. But if we combine the joint risks of climate change or floods and poverty, you see what is the region that stands out. It's sub-Saharan Africa. So that's a key challenge that we'll also have to confront. And the second one is conflict and fragility. This is a very also worrisome trend, and it's the growing association between poverty and fragility and conflict. When we look at the 43 economies with the highest poverty rates, all of them are part of the group of fragile and conflict states, or in sub-Saharan Africa. So they meet one or both of these conditions. And in the last 20 years, what we observed is that poverty rates fell sharply in countries that were never fragile or conflict affected, or in countries that briefly experience a fragility of conflict but escape quickly out of it. So in contrast, poverty rates in recurrent or chronic fragile countries fell only marginally in the last 20 years. So where to focus on? Well, I guess the answer, if you look at this graph, might be quite obvious, is nowadays, we estimate that more than 80% of the poor are in two regions, South Asia, but mostly in sub-Saharan Africa. But based on our forecasts going up to 2030, we estimate that 9 in 10 extreme poor will be in sub-Saharan Africa. So these at least regionally should be the area, the part of the world where this battle against poverty alleviation needs to be fought. Okay, last two slides. I promise no more than a couple of minutes. I didn't want to finish the presentation without saying something about policies, right? But I think first we have to recognize that the policy agenda to tackle these challenges is vast and complex, and it varies with country context, institutions, political situation, fiscal capacity. Many different factors shape the right policy mix. However, I would like to highlight 5 key objectives that I think should be considered to at least bring a more inclusive focus during the recovery phase. And the first one is leveling the playing field for everyone. Efforts need to be devoted to addressing gaps in access to goods and services that are needed to develop the productive capacity of individuals. And by that, I mean health, education, access to water, sanitation, electricity. And to make sure that this human capital, this extra physical and financial capital can be put to good use to earn fair returns, meaning access to fair markets. So that's the first principle I think is important. The second one is we need to have a stronger effectiveness, efficiency, and equity in the fiscal system. And by that, I mean that all these investments that I said need to be made in the first bullet require a fiscal system that collects the revenues that are necessary to make these investments, but needs to be done in a more transparent way while minimizing economic distortions and ensuring an equitable allocation of expenditures. The third one is jobs, jobs, and jobs. I mean, in spite of the current large intervention of the public sector, we should not forget that private sector growth is and will continue to be the main engine of economic progress and income growth. But still many barriers, many structural issues create barriers in the business environment that discourage investments, firm growth, formalization, and more importantly, job creation. So that I think is an important focus. The fourth one is preparing the labor force for the new economy. The economy will increasingly rely on automation and information technologies. Now we're having these meetings through Zoom, but not everyone with the current skills and the current capital can be employable in this new world. So we need to retrain, to modify school curriculum, to provide social insurance when needed to facilitate the transition of workers to this new world. And finally, is resilience. We need to continue building resilience. This is not the last crisis. I mean, it might be, hopefully, there won't be crisis as big as this one, but it won't be the last one. And different shocks will be happening. So we need to prepare our social protection systems, our health systems, to deal with the next shock. These systems need to be adapted to varying risks. It's not the same thing dealing with the effect of an earthquake than dealing with the effects of a pandemic, as it has been evident. Last slide. And in doing this last slide, I was thinking, should I end on a positive note or not? And then I couldn't resist the temptation to talk about what I call the long road ahead. And I want to make the point linking to the current debate on the global distribution of vaccines against COVID-19. If all goes according to plan, much of the world will suffer a long wait because basically jobs will be distributed inequality. And so I took this graph from one of the latest issues of The Economist. It's very telling. It shows the doses per adult across different countries, and on the vertical axis, and on the horizontal axis, you have the Human Development Index, which is a proxy of level of development countries. So as the Human Development Index goes down, what you see is most countries with relatively low or medium levels of development have, on average, less than 2 doses ensured per person, right? And then as development increases and we're looking at more advanced economies, you see that countries like Canada secure 11 doses per person. UK, more than 8 per person. So I think this is very telling of how deep, how rooted are these inequalities globally and within countries. So I want to finish this talk with a number, which is 2024. Why that? What if I'm a leader of your country and I tell you the following? Don't worry. All the adult population in our nation will be fully inoculated by the end of 2024. What would be your reaction? I think you would be probably very upset, scared, right? 2024, sorry, waiting until 2024. Well, based on our current projections, this might be the reality for most countries in sub-Saharan Africa. They won't be fully vaccinated until 2024. And 9 out of 10 poor people will be there in a few years. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Baez, for this very interesting talk. Now we're going to have some time for questions and answers. If you have a question, please press the raise hand button and I will invite you to unmute your microphone. Thank you. Oh, we have a question. I'm gonna unmute. We cannot see the name of the person who is raising the hand. It's Huawei Mate 9. I will ask to unmute. You can ask your question.
Good afternoon. Am I unmuted?
Oh, we can hear you. We can hear you well.
Well, thank you very much for this very complex reflection on the situation of COVID and the middle and transition. I would like to thank your reflections on the efforts that so far are relying on government capacity to roll out vaccination process. What would be your opinion of a shared effort due to the size of this challenge with private sectors, especially in developing countries?
Okay, thanks. I guess perhaps while others collect their thoughts and want to ask a question, let me just say something about this. Yes, I see. We see a lot of disparities in the capacity. I mean, this is obvious. You know, we cannot compare the capacities of low-income countries to vaccinate their population in a few months vis-a-vis the most advanced countries. And we have seen the progress that countries like Israel, UK, and the US have made in rolling out the vaccine. So those implementation disparities or gaps were evident even well before the vaccines were made available. What is more worrisome, I think, is that many countries, and I would say mostly countries, middle and upper middle countries, have the capacity to roll out more vaccines, yet they were not able to secure the needed supplies. True, meeting the demand now for vaccines is a very difficult challenge. But what you see in the last graph that I showed is that in spite of that, the level of development is a very strong predictor of the amount of vaccines that countries will or manage to secure. And I wouldn't be surprised if we will be talking still 1 year from now about what fraction of the population has been vaccinated in countries in Latin America and in other parts of the world. So that's why unfortunately, I think it will be a long road ahead before we can achieve this herd immunity that we all are waiting for.
Thank you. I also see we have a question on the chat from Sofia Morales. She's asking, how much time do you expect the economy will start seeing a gradual recovery?
Thank you. How nice to receive a question from my own wife. So yeah, very good. Very good question. And it varies a lot. I think countries like the US will see a very quick recovery. We actually see positive consumption growth in January and February in the United States. I think the situation will be almost close to normal by the middle of the year. For other countries, it really depends largely on what you know already, which is what amount of the population can be vaccinated, but at the same time, if the social distancing and measures can be observed by people, how firms can't adapt to these current conditions. What we see is an interesting pattern is that the first peak of the pandemic hit the global economy very, very badly. But then the second peak or the second wave that happened in the last quarter of 2020 in Europe and in the United States, more recently in Latin America, have a much smaller impact on GDP. And part of the reason is that the economy structurally adapted better to the newer conditions. So now we see many activities that are happening that before COVID we never imagined would be happening in a virtual world. So unfortunately, I think again, the amount of people vaccinated, the share of the population vaccinated, will be a strong predictor of the recovery for many countries.
Thank you. Now I'm seeing that Nestor David Medina has raised the hand.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you for your time, for your presentation. I'd like to ask if, is there any new strategy of the bank in the situation of pandemic crisis? Because I saw the presentation, all the classic routes about the package of measures that the bank is trying to implement now. I think is the same like the direction of the bank was using in another crisis. So do you think that has the bank a new focus for the post-pandemic crisis, specific in 2020? You know, the war is different than 10 years ago with the Asia crisis, for example, but I couldn't see new strategies or new implementation. The specific question is, has the bank now a different, more than classic views about the resolve new one crisis? Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Nestor. What a great question. And I think, to be very honest, everyone has been learning new things out of this pandemic. Everyone, every country, everyone, including we at the World Bank. This has been an unprecedented crisis, and many of the elements that inform our strategies to support countries in addressing these challenges remain relevant. Many of the consequences of the COVID have happened in the past. But we are also reinvigorating some more aspects that perhaps were not high enough in the agenda before. And one of them, for instance, is green growth. This is an opportunity to rebuild back our economies, to build them back, but also use this as an opportunity to address the challenge of climate change. So that's one that we have been reinforcing now in our dialogue and our financial support to countries. And a second one is risk preparedness. I think this crisis has made very evident that countries need better risk preparedness frameworks. And so that this is something that we have been working more closely with our government clients. And of course, there is a strong human development content in our strategy. We have been able to mobilize our financial support more quickly than before. Yeah. We have many procedures in the past to be able to facilitate, to mobilize our financial resources. We at the bank also learn to be more agile and to be more responsive. So still, we have many things that we can do better, and we are approaching this crisis also an opportunity to be more effective and in supporting our client countries. Thank you, Nestor. I think you have a follow-up question, right?
Just, can I?
Yes, of course, yes.
Doctor, do you see any transformations in terms of the administration of the bank? Maybe a new office, or new officials in the world that try to help in the crisis, or the same structure of the bank? Talking about the administrative structure of the bank. I know that is so difficult. I am not thinking about change the structure of the bank, but maybe any new office was open or more personnel was dedicated in focusing in that moment, or the same administrative staff is maintained working in the crisis?
Well, I'm perhaps not the right person to answer that. My work is mostly analytical, technical research. What I can tell you from my own experience is that we have been asked to prioritize our support in line with the needs of our client countries, consistent with the current crisis. And I think the bank has made an effort to mobilize resources in that way.
Thank you. Now I see we have a question from Chris K.
Yes, hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Dr. Baez. What a wonderful and insightful presentation. I also want to thank the Embassy of Colombia and Spain for bringing this to us. I thought it was fantastic. My quick question is sort of on a narrow topic. I'm joining from the United States, and you hinted that we're sort of on the eve of passing, hopefully through a $1.9 trillion surplus relief bill to help hopefully the situation in this country. But the question that I have is, you have developed countries worrying about inflation because of potentially heating up economies due to these sort of government support packages. What effect do you think is realistic over the short term of seeing inflation and the effect on the countries that you mentioned that are developing and their ability to be able to purchase the staples and needs if those prices go up?
Thank you, Chris, for this great question. I think the answer varies from country to country. The macroeconomic conditions are very different. In the United States, actually, as surprising as this might be, many households have been able to recover, as you saw. There is just a share of low-income households that they haven't yet. But the majority of the economy has been able to recover. So there are natural concerns to think that this additional money in the pockets of these people could increase the demand, the aggregated demand of the country to levels that can start pushing prices up. I think from a low-income perspective, a developing country perspective, this is less of an issue. There are other countries that are dealing with the issue of inflation, even well before the pandemic, and Turkey is one of them. But in majority of the developing countries, there is still a lot of room for more fiscal and monetary policies to alleviate the effects of the crisis before we have to worry about inflation. I think the challenge in these countries is actually the lack of resources, limited fiscal power, and lack of capacity and institutions to channel these resources to those who are in most need. Thanks.
Thank you very much. We also saw that Sandra Herrera raised her hand.
Hi, good morning, everybody. I'm Dr. Javier. I have a question for you, and it's regarding, I live in the US, and we have seen that the government implement the stimulus package, for instance, and we have seen that they try to spend trillions of dollars, like try to protect the low-income population, But my question is, you say jobs, we need to create jobs, jobs, and jobs. How a country can set up the ideal resources to promote those jobs and also to support the low income generation?
No, thank you. Thanks, Sandra, for this also extremely relevant point. And it basically links to aspects that are a key in not only in this discussion, but in the agenda ahead, is how to ensure that more jobs are generated and that these jobs benefit unskilled workers, low-income families. So that's complex. I don't think there is a single policy intervention that can address it, but I can tell you some principles are many countries, and when I say many countries, perhaps this doesn't apply to the US, although some of these issues apply to the US, but in many developing countries, we still see a lot of inefficiencies in markets, many constraints to business creation, still a lot of market power, big monopolies. And so making markets more competitive and also attracting more investments. But at the same time, educating the labor force for the new jobs, for the requirements of the labor force are absolutely necessary. You and I are now having this conference through Zoom. We have laptops, we have the ability to use our computers, but many households don't have that. Even if they have the computer, they don't have how to use them. So I'm talking about also reskilling the labor force. So it's a complex agenda, as I said, but I think in our dialogue with countries, we have been able to identify some of the structural challenges that are basically preventing faster job creation in these countries.
Great. Well,
I think you are muted, Valeria.
thank you. Well, if we don't have any further questions, I would like to once again thank you all for your participation, as well to our speaker and to the World Bank for making these events possible. We hope you all enjoy the content of this conference and found it interesting. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Good
Thank you
afternoon.
so much.
Thank you. Thanks.